One chilly Thursday morning, I watched from my front porch as the final determination came down. Preston's permits were suspended. The stop work order became permanent until every violation was corrected, and the county ordered the complete removal of the stone patio, large sections of the pool deck, and the outdoor kitchen that had once been the centerpiece of his backyard. The demolition estimate alone was staggering, and once engineering fees, permit revisions, utility inspections, and reconstruction costs were tallied up, people around the neighborhood quietly guessed the damage would climb well past $300,000. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same machines that had destroyed my flower beds rolled back onto his property, except this time, they weren't building his dream backyard. They were tearing it apart one truckload at a time. I remember standing by the old maple tree one afternoon as enormous slabs of custom stone were lifted into dump trucks. The pounding of hydraulic breakers echoed across the neighborhood for hours, and every strike reminded me of the afternoon I'd pulled into my driveway believing someone had simply made an honest mistake. Preston hardly came outside anymore. When he did, the confidence that once filled every conversation had completely vanished. One afternoon, he walked over while workers loaded broken concrete into a container. For a moment I thought he wanted another argument, but instead he stood quietly near the property line and finally said, "I should have talked to you first." I looked at him for a few seconds before answering. "Yeah, you should have." He nodded without making excuses. "My survey company told me everything was fine. I wanted to believe them because it gave me what I wanted." I shrugged. "Maybe, but you didn't just trust them. You ignored me when I showed you my deed. And you tore out something you knew meant a lot to me." He glanced toward the empty patch where my garden used to be and lowered his eyes. There wasn't really anything else to say. Sometimes an apology comes too late to undo the damage, but it's still better than pretending nothing happened. Over the following months, contractors rebuilt his backyard to meet the county's requirements, though by then the project had drained far more money than he ever expected. Between construction loans, legal bills, redesign costs, HOA penalties for unauthorized improvements, and the drop in property value during the dispute, he eventually put the house up for sale. Word around the neighborhood was that he accepted an offer well below what he'd invested, simply to put the whole ordeal behind him. A local family bought the property, finished the remaining repairs, and within weeks introduced themselves by bringing homemade cookies to every house on the street. Funny how different a neighborhood feels when people lead with kindness instead of entitlement. As for my own property, the county completed an official resurvey and installed permanent steel boundary monuments at every key corner. Public Works also updated their digital records so future contractors could clearly identify the protected easement before applying for permits. The following spring, I spent my time rebuilding the garden one section at a time. My daughter flew in for a weekend, and together we planted new roses where the old ones had been torn out. They weren't the same bushes my wife had planted all those years earlier, and they never would be. But watching fresh blooms appear felt less like replacing the past and more like honoring it. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if it was really worth fighting over 10 feet of land. I always give them the same answer. It was never about 10 feet. It was about the moment someone decided that money, confidence, and a polished smile mattered more than respect, honesty, and boundaries. If I'd stayed quiet because it seemed easier, those 10 feet would have become someone else's truth simply because enough time had passed. Sometimes protecting what belongs to you isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the next person understands that rules apply to everyone, even the ones who think they're too successful to follow them. Back to my garage. My old workbench sat exactly where it always had, covered with dusty boxes my wife used to call my museum of things I'll probably need someday. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet, only that something about Vanessa's story felt too neat, too convenient, too perfectly timed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, buried beneath decades of ordinary life, an old conversation with my late father kept trying to work its way back into my memory. One sentence I hadn't thought about in years, something he'd said while helping build this neighborhood before I ever bought this house. At that moment, I couldn't remember the words, but I had a feeling they were about to change everything. I spent the rest of that afternoon pulling dusty boxes off old shelves, opening faded file folders that hadn't seen daylight in decades, and wondering if I was chasing a memory that didn't even exist. My father had been an electrical foreman for a regional utility contractor back in the early 80s, and before he passed away, he saved almost everything: blueprints, inspection reports, handwritten notes, photographs, even coffee-stained maps folded so many times the edges had gone soft as cloth. My wife used to tease him that if civilization ever collapsed, he'd probably rebuild the entire county from his filing cabinet. At the time, it seemed ridiculous. That evening, it felt like the smartest habit anyone had ever developed. About an hour into digging through the boxes, I found a thick tube labeled Cedar Ridge Phase 1 utility plans. Cedar Ridge, our subdivision. My heart started beating a little faster. I rolled the drawings across the workbench and weighed the corners down with old paint cans. There it was, every water line, sewer connection, gas trench, and electrical route laid out in incredible detail. Then I saw the heavy red stripe running almost perfectly beneath the section Vanessa claimed belonged to her. Main electrical distribution easement, 20 feet wide. Permanent utility access. No permanent structures permitted. I stared at those words for a long time before reading them again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Suddenly my father's voice came back as clearly as if he were standing beside me. Never build over a utility easement, Danny. Doesn't matter who owns the land. The easement always comes first. I actually laughed out loud. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that comes when two puzzle pieces finally lock together after you've spent hours trying to force the wrong picture. Vanessa had spent thousands on surveyors, lawyers, architects, and contractors, yet somehow nobody had bothered checking what was underneath the ground they were building on. The next morning, I walked the property before sunrise, carrying the blueprint, a measuring tape, my phone, and a notebook. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for facts. Every measurement lined up almost perfectly. The retaining wall crossed directly over the easement. The foundation for the outdoor kitchen sat inside the restricted access zone. Even worse, workers had already poured concrete footings where utility crews would need to bring excavation equipment if the electrical line ever failed. Around 9 o'clock, my neighbor across the street, an older retired mail carrier named Frank, wandered over holding his coffee mug. "Looks like you've been busy," he said. I handed him the blueprint. His eyebrows slowly climbed higher the longer he looked. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's the main feeder." "Exactly. Does she know?" "I honestly don't think she does." Frank shook his head. "Or maybe she thinks rules don't apply if your lawyer charges enough per hour." That made both of us laugh, but only for a second, because underneath the joke was a real problem. If those electrical lines were ever damaged, dozens of homes could lose power. Worse than that, someone could get hurt. By lunchtime, I'd photographed everything from every angle imaginable: close-ups, wide shots, measurements showing exactly where each new structure sat, fresh excavation marks, equipment tracks, utility reference markers hidden in the grass that had somehow escaped the construction crew. I even found one old concrete survey monument almost completely buried beneath loose dirt. Somebody had nearly covered it with landscaping stone. Once I finished documenting everything, I called the regional utility company. After navigating what felt like a dozen automated menus, I finally reached an engineering supervisor named Melissa. She listened quietly while I explained what I'd found. I expected skepticism. Instead, she interrupted me halfway through. "Did you say permanent structures over the primary distribution easement?" "That's right. Can you email me photographs and the location immediately?" Her tone had completely changed. Within 20 minutes, everything was in her inbox. Then I sent identical copies to the city's electrical inspector, planning office, the county, and the Public Utilities Commission. I didn't exaggerate anything. I didn't accuse Vanessa of being malicious. I simply provided documentation and let the facts speak for themselves. Monday passed quietly. Tuesday morning, I was watering what remained of my backyard when I heard heavy diesel engines coming down the street. 3 utility trucks turned the corner, followed by 2 city inspection vehicles. They parked directly in front of Vanessa's house. Workers climbed out wearing high-visibility jackets while 2 inspectors carried clipboards and rolled up site maps. Vanessa stepped outside wearing expensive workout clothes and oversized sunglasses, smiling like she assumed everyone had arrived to admire her renovation. I could barely hear the conversation from my yard, but I caught enough pieces to understand the mood changed almost immediately. One inspector asked for permits. Another asked who approved construction inside the easement. Vanessa pointed toward her contractor, who looked just as confused as everyone else. Within minutes, the utility supervisor unfolded a large map across the hood of his truck. 3 employees began marking measurements with bright orange paint. Then one of them stopped, looked toward the excavation, and immediately called the others over. Something wasn't right. About 10 minutes later, Melissa, the same supervisor I'd spoken with on the phone, walked over to my fence. "Mr. Harper?" she asked. "That's me. Thank you for contacting us. You may have prevented a very serious incident. How bad is it?" She looked back toward the construction site before answering. "Their excavation appears to have damaged protective conduit surrounding the primary electrical feed. We won't know the full extent until we expose the line, but nobody should have been digging here in the first place." Right on cue, another worker waved his arms and shouted for everyone to stop. The entire site fell silent. Even from 50 yards away, I could tell something significant had happened. Melissa excused herself and hurried back across the yard. Half an hour later, bright red notices were taped to the temporary fencing. Stop work order. Restricted utility access. Immediate safety review required. Vanessa marched toward the lead inspector, looking furious enough to melt asphalt. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I have a licensed surveyor and a licensed attorney." The inspector didn't raise his voice. "Neither one has the authority to eliminate a recorded utility easement. The property belongs to me. Ownership and easement rights are 2 different things, ma'am. We'll fix whatever paperwork you think is missing." "This isn't paperwork." He pointed toward the ground beneath the unfinished patio. "This is infrastructure serving every home on this block." For the first time since this whole mess began, Vanessa looked genuinely uncertain. Not scared yet, just confused. She'd spent weeks believing every problem could be solved with another consultant or another check. Now she was discovering there are some things money doesn't erase. The following day, excavation crews returned, but not to continue building. They carefully removed sections of fresh concrete so utility technicians could inspect the buried conduit. By mid-afternoon, the preliminary findings became official. Construction equipment had fractured protective shielding around the electrical system. While the power lines themselves remained intact, the damage created enough long-term risk that repairs were mandatory before anyone could legally continue work. Then came the second report. Because permanent access had already been obstructed by retaining walls, plumbing trenches, and structural foundations, the entire expansion violated multiple utility protection requirements. Every major improvement planned for that luxury backyard now stood inside an area where it could never legally remain. I watched Vanessa sitting alone on her patio that evening, long after the contractors had left. The music was gone. The delivery trucks were gone. Even the confidence she'd worn like expensive perfume seemed to have disappeared. For just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I looked at the empty patch where Ellen's roses used to bloom, and whatever sympathy I had quietly slipped away. I still had no idea how expensive this mistake was about to become. But one thing was finally clear: the fight had shifted completely. This was no longer about 15 feet of backyard. It had become a battle between arrogance and the kind of laws that had been sitting underground for more than 40 years, patiently waiting for someone to ignore them. The official decision came about 6 weeks later, although by then everyone in the neighborhood already knew which way things were headed. Utility easements aren't suggestions, and they certainly aren't something a private survey or an expensive attorney can erase. Once the engineering reports were finalized, the city issued its order. Every permanent improvement built inside the protected corridor had to be removed. The retaining wall, the expanded pool deck, the outdoor kitchen, the custom spa, even portions of the new landscaping. All of it had to go. I happened to be trimming the hedge along my driveway the morning the demolition crew showed up. Felt strangely familiar. Weeks earlier, I'd stood in almost the exact same spot, watching machines destroy something I cared about. Only this time, they weren't crossing onto my property. They were tearing apart work that never should have existed in the first place. Vanessa walked outside just as the first section of stone decking was lifted into the air. She wasn't wearing designer sunglasses anymore. There was no coffee in her hand, no confident smile, no speech prepared by an attorney. She simply stood there with her arms folded, staring at a project she'd poured months of planning and a small fortune into. At one point, she noticed me across the fence. We looked at each other for several long seconds before she slowly walked over. "You knew," she said quietly. It wasn't really a question. I nodded. I remembered. She looked down at the ground between us. "You could have come talk to me." I took a slow breath before answering. "Vanessa, I did come talk to you. The morning your crew tore up my wife's rose garden. You handed me legal papers before I could finish my first sentence." She closed her eyes for a moment. There wasn't much either of us could add after that. Some conversations end because people reach an agreement, others end because the truth finally catches up with everyone involved. Over the next month, the bills kept arriving. Demolition costs, engineering inspections, utility repairs, replacement of damaged conduit, site restoration, permit violations. None of it was covered by her insurance, because the investigation concluded that the construction had taken place inside a recorded utility easement without the necessary approvals. Every appeal her attorneys filed reached the same conclusion. The easement had existed for decades. It had been properly recorded. It had never disappeared. No private property dispute could cancel public utility access. Eventually, the concrete was gone. The heavy equipment disappeared, and utility crews installed permanent boundary markers that stood waist-high along the protected corridor. They weren't attractive, but that wasn't their purpose. They were there to make sure nobody ever tried this again. A few weeks later, another truck pulled into my driveway, this one carrying fresh soil, mature rose bushes, and 2 landscapers hired by the utility company as part of the final restoration agreement. One of them asked if I had any preference for where the flowers should go. I smiled and pulled an old photograph from my wallet. One Ellen and I had taken almost 20 years earlier, with those same roses blooming behind us. "Just like this," I said. They recreated the garden as closely as they could. And when they finished, I sat on the back porch until sunset, looking at flowers that weren't exactly the originals, but somehow carried the same feeling. It reminded me that while you can't always recover what gets damaged, sometimes you can protect what mattered enough that it continues in a different form. As for Vanessa, she listed her house for sale less than a year later. Maybe the financial hit became too much. Maybe she simply wanted to leave behind a neighborhood where everyone knew the story. I honestly don't know. And these days, I don't spend much time wondering. Holding on to anger is a lot like holding on to broken concrete. Eventually, it becomes heavier than the lesson it taught you. Looking back, people often ask if I felt like I'd won. The truth is, I don't think anybody really wins when neighbors end up in courtrooms and construction crews replace conversations. I'd have traded every legal victory for one respectful discussion before the first shovel ever touched the ground. But if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that confidence is never a substitute for facts, and money will never rewrite laws that were designed to protect everyone. Sometimes the most valuable thing you own isn't visible from the street. Sometimes it's an old blueprint tucked inside a dusty garage, a lesson your father mentioned decades ago, or a promise you quietly made to the person who planted roses beside you and trusted you'd take care of them long after they were gone. Those turned out to be worth far more than any luxury backyard ever could. If you've made it this far, I'd really like to hear what you think. Was I right to let the law take its course instead of warning Vanessa after I found the utility plans? Or should neighbors always get one more chance before facing the consequences of their own choices? Share your opinion in the comments because I'd genuinely like to know where you stand. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes property lines and respect should always go hand in hand.